Chapter 5. All Eve wanted was a candy bar. She'd spent most of the day testifying in court, and her lunch break had been eaten up by a call from a snitch that had cost her $50 and gained her a slim lead on a smuggling case that had resulted in 2 homicides, which she'd been beating her head against for 2 months. All she wanted was a quick hit of sugar substitute before she headed home to prep for her 7 o'clock meeting with Robb. She could have zipped through any number of drive-through Insta stores, but she preferred the little deli on the corner of West 78 despite, or perhaps because of the fact that it was owned and run by Francois, a rude, snake-eyed refugee who'd fled to America after the Social Reform Army had overthrown the French government some 40 years before. He hated America and Americans, and the SRA had been dispatched within 6 months of the coup, but Francois remained, bitching and complaining behind the counter of the 78th Street deli where he enjoyed dispensing insults and political absurdities. Eve called him Frank to annoy him, and dropped in at least once a week to see what scheme he'd devised to try to short credit her. Her mind on the candy bar, she stepped through the automatic door. It had no more than begun to whisper shut behind her when instinct kicked in. The man standing at the counter had his back to her, his heavy, hooded jacket masking all but his size, and that was impressive. 6'5", she estimated, easily 250. She didn't need to see Francois' thin, terrified face to know there was trouble. She could smell it, as ripe and sour as the vegetable hash that was today's special. In the seconds it took the door to clink shut, she'd considered and rejected the idea of drawing her weapon. "Over here, bitch." Now, the man turned. Eve saw he had the pale gold complexion of a multiracial heritage and the eyes of a very desperate man. Even as she filed the description, she looked at the small round object he held in his hand. The homemade explosive device was worry enough. The fact that it shook as the hand that held it trembled with nerves was a great deal worse. Homemade boomers were notoriously unstable. The idiot was likely to kill all of them by sweating too freely. She shot Francois a quick, warning look. If he called her lieutenant, they were all going to be meet very quickly. Keeping her hands in plain sight, she crossed to the counter. "I don't want any trouble," she said, letting her voice tremble as nervously as the thief's hand. "Please, I got kids at home." "Shut up, just shut up." "Down on the floor." "Down on the fucking floor." Eve knelt, slipping a hand under her jacket where the weapon waited. "All of it," the man ordered, gesturing with a deadly little ball. "I want all of it." "Cash, credit tokens." "Make it fast." "It's been a slow day," Francois whined. "You must understand business is not what it was." "You Americans, say you want to eat this?" the man invited, shoving the explosive in Francois' face. "No, number." Panicked, Francois punched in the security code with his shaking fingers. As the till opened, Eve saw the thief glance at the money inside, then up at the camera that was busily recording the entire transaction. She saw it in his face. He knew his image was locked there, and that all the money in New York wouldn't erase it. The explosive would, tossed carelessly over his shoulder as he raced out to the street to be swallowed in traffic. She sucked in a breath, like a diver going under. She came up hard, under his arm. The solid jolt had the device flying free. Screams, curses, prayers. She caught it in her fingertips, a high fly, shagged with 2 men out and the bases loaded. Even as she closed her hand around it, the thief swung out. It was the back of his hand rather than a fist, and Eve considered herself lucky. She saw stars as she hit a stand of soy chips, but she held on to the homemade boomer. Wrong hand, goddammit, wrong hand. She had time to think as the stand collapsed under her. She tried to use her left to free her weapon, but the 250 pounds of fury and desperation fell on her. "Hit the alarm, you asshole," she shouted as Francois stood like a statue with his mouth opening and closing. "Hit the fucking alarm." Then she grunted as the blow to her ribs stole her breath. This time he'd used his fist. He was weeping now, scratching and clawing up her arm in an attempt to reach the explosive. "I need the money. I got to have it. I'll kill you. I'll kill you all." She managed to bring her knee up. The age-old defense bought her a few seconds, but lacked the power to debilitate. She saw stars again as her head smacked sharply into the side of a counter. Dozens of the candy bars she'd craved rained down on her. "You son of a bitch. You son of a bitch." She heard herself saying it, over and over as she landed 3 hard short arm blows to his face. Blood spurting from his nose, He grabbed her arm, and she knew it was going to break. Knew she would feel that sharp, sweet pain, hear the thin crack as bone fractured. But just as she drew in breath to scream, as her vision began to gray with agony, his weight was off her. The ball still cupped in her hand, she rolled over onto her haunches, struggling to breathe and fighting the need to retch. From that position she saw the shiny black shoes that always said "Beat Cop, Book Him." She coughed once, painfully. Attempted robbery, armed, carrying an explosive, assault. She'd have liked to have added assaulting an officer and resisting arrest, but as she hadn't identified herself, she'd be skirting the line. "You all right, ma'am? Want the mounts?" She didn't want the Meditex. She wanted a fucking candy bar. "Lieutenant," she corrected, pushing herself up and reaching for her ID. She noted that the perp was in restraints, and that one of the two cops had been wise enough to use his stunner to take the fight out of him. "We need a safe boxy quick." She watched both cops pale as they saw what she held in her hand. This little boomer's had quite the ride. "Let's get it neutralized, sir." The first cop was out of the store in a flash. In the 90 seconds it took him to return with the black box used for transporting and deactivating explosives, no one spoke. They hardly breathed. "Book him," Eve repeated. The moment the explosive was contained, her stomach muscles began to tremble. "I'll transmit my report." "You guys with the 123rd? "You bet, Lieutenant." "Good job." She reached down, favoring her injured arm, and chose a galaxy bar that hadn't been flattened by the wrestling match. "I'm going home." "You didn't pay for that," Francois shouted after her. "Fuck you, Frank," she shouted back and kept going. The incident put her behind schedule. By the time she reached Rourke's mansion, it was 7:10. She'd used over-the-counter medication to ease the pain in her arm and shoulder. If it wasn't better in a couple of days, she knew she'd have to go in for an exam. She hated doctors. She parked the car and spent a moment studying Rourke's house. Fortress, more like, she thought. Its 4 stories towered over the frosted trees of Central Park. It was one of the old buildings, close to 200 years old, built of actual stone. If her eyes didn't deceive her, there was lots of glass, and lights burning gold behind the windows. There was also a security gate, behind which evergreen shrubs and elegant trees were artistically arranged. Even more impressive than the magnificence of architecture and landscaping was the quiet. She heard no city noises here, no traffic snarls, no pedestrian chaos. Even the sky overhead was subtly different than the one she was accustomed to farther downtown. Here, you could actually see stars rather than the glint and gleam of transports. "Nice life if you can get it," she mused, and started her car again. She approached the gate, prepared to identify herself. She saw the tiny red eye of a scanner blink, then hold steady. The gates opened soundlessly. So, he'd programmed her in, she thought, unsure if she was amused or uneasy. She went through the gate, up the short drive, and left her car at the base of granite steps. A butler opened the door for her. She'd never actually seen a butler outside of old videos, but this one didn't disappoint the fantasy. He was silver-haired, implacably eyed and dressed in a dark suit and ruthlessly knotted old-fashioned tie. "Lieutenant Dallas." There was an accent, a faint one that sounded British and Slavic at once. "I have an appointment with Rourke. He's expecting you." He ushered her into a wide, towering hallway that looked more like the entrance to a museum than a home. There was a chandelier of star-shaped glass dripping light onto a glossy wood floor that was graced by a boldly patterned rug in shades of red and teal. A stairway curved away to the left with a carved griffin for its newel post. There were paintings on the walls of the kind she had once seen on a school field trip to the Met. French Impressionists from what century she couldn't quite recall. The revisited period that had come into being in the early 21st century complemented them with their pastoral scenes and gloriously muted colors. No holograms or living sculpture, just paint and canvas. "May I take your coat?" She brought herself back and thought she caught a flicker of smug condescension in those inscrutable eyes. Eve shrugged out of her jacket, watched him take the leather somewhat gingerly between his manicured fingers. Hell, she'd gotten most of the blood off it. "This way, Lieutenant Dallas." "If you wouldn't mind waiting in the parlor, Rourke is detained on a Trans-Pacific call. No problem. The museum quality continued there. A fire was burning sedately. A fire out of genuine logs in a hearth carved from lapis and malachite. 2 lamps burned with light like colored gems. The twin sofas had curved backs and lush upholstery that echoed the jewel tones of the room in sapphire. The furniture was wood, polished to an almost painful gloss. Here and there objects star were arranged. Sculptures, bowls, faceted glass. Her boots clicked over wood, then muffled over carpet. "Would you like a refreshment, Lieutenant?" She glanced back, saw with amusement that he continued to hold her jacket between his fingers like a soiled rag. "Sure." "What have you got, Mr. A? "Somerset, Lieutenant." "Simply Somerset, and I'm sure we can provide you with whatever suits your taste." "She's fond of coffee," Rourke said from the doorway, "but I think she'd like to try them on cart 49. Somerset's eyes flickered again, with horror, Eve thought. "The 49, sir?" "That's right." "Thank you, Somerset." "Yes, sir." Dangling the jacket, he exited, stiff-spined. "Sorry I kept you waiting," Rourke began, then his eyes narrowed, darkened. "No problem," Eve said as he crossed to her. "I was just. Hey." She jerked her chin as his hand cupped it, but his fingers held firm, turning her left cheek to the light. "Your face is bruised." His voice was cool on the statement, icily so. His eyes as they flicked over the injury betrayed nothing. But his fingers were warm, tensed, and jolted something in her gut. "A scuffle over a candy bar," she said with a shrug. His eyes met hers, held just an instant longer than comfortable. "Who won?" "I did." "It's a mistake to come between me and food." "I'll keep that in mind." He released her, dipped the hand that had touched her into his pocket. Because he wanted to touch her again. It worried him that he wanted, very much, to stroke away the bruise that marred her cheek. "I think you'll approve of tonight's menu." "Menu?" "I didn't come here to eat, Rourke. I came here to look over your collection." "You'll do both." He turned when Somerset brought in a tray that held an uncorked bottle of wine the color of ripened wheat and 2 crystal glasses. "The 49, sir." "Thank you. I'll pour out." He spoke to Eve as he did so. "I thought this vintage would suit you." "What it lacks in subtlety." He turned back, offering her a glass. "It makes up for in sensuality." He tapped his glass against hers so the crystal sang, then watched as she sipped. God, what a face, he thought. All those angles and expressions, all that emotion and control. Just now she was fighting off showing both surprise and pleasure as the taste of the wine settled on her tongue. He was looking forward to the moment when the taste of her settled on his. "You approve?" he asked. "It's good." It was the equivalent of sipping gold. "I'm glad." "The Montcart was my first venture into wineries. Shall we sit and enjoy the fire?" It was tempting. She could almost see herself sitting there, legs angled toward the fragrant heat, sipping wine as the jeweled light danced. "This isn't a social call, Rourke. It's a murder investigation." "Then you can investigate me over dinner." He took her arm, lifting a brow as she stiffened. "I'd think a woman who'd fight for a candy bar would appreciate a 2-inch fillet, medium rare." "Steak?" She struggled not to drool. "Real steak, from a cow?" A smile curved his lips. "Just flown in from Montana." "The steak, not the cow." When she continued to hesitate, he tilted his head. "Come now, Lieutenant, I doubt if a little red meat will clog your considerable investigative skills." "Someone tried to bribe me the other day," she muttered, thinking of Charles Monroe and his black silk robe. "With nothing as interesting as steak." She aimed one long, level look. "If the evidence points in your direction, Rourke, I'm still bringing you down." "I'd expect nothing less." "Let's eat." He led her into the dining room. More crystal, more gleaming wood, yet another shimmering fire, this time cupped in rose-veined marble. A woman in a black suit served them appetizers of shrimp swimming in creamy sauce. The wine was brought in, their glasses topped off. Eve, who rarely gave a thought to her appearance, wished she'd worn something more suitable to the occasion than jeans and a sweater. "So, how'd you get rich?" she asked him. "Various ways." He liked to watch her eat. He discovered there was a single-mindedness to it. "Name one." "Desire," he said, and let the word hum between them. "Not good enough." She picked up her wine again, meeting his eyes straight on. "Most people want to be rich. They don't want it enough to fight for it. Take risks for it." "But you did." "I did." "Being poor is. uncomfortable. I like comfort. He offered her a roll from a silver bowl as their salads were served, crisp greens tossed with delicate herbs. We're not so different, Eve. Yeah, right. You wanted to be a cop enough to fight for it, to take risks for it. You find the breaking of laws uncomfortable. I make money. You make justice. Neither is a simple matter. He waited a moment. Do you know what Sharon de Blas wanted? Her fork hesitated, then pierced a tender shoot of endive that had been plucked only an hour before. What do you think she wanted? Power. Sex is often a way to gain it. She had enough money to be comfortable, but she wanted more. Because money is also power. She wanted power over her clients, over herself, and most of all, she wanted power over her family. Eve set her fork down. In the firelight, the dancing glow of candle and crystal, he looked dangerous. Not because a woman would fear him, she thought, but because she would desire him. Shadows played in his eyes, making them unreadable. That's quite an analysis of a woman you claim you hardly knew. It doesn't take long to form an opinion, particularly if that person is obvious. She didn't have your depth, Eve, your control, or your rather enviable focus. We're not talking about me. No, she didn't want him to talk about Hera or to look at her in quite that way. Your opinion is that she was hungry for power. Hungry enough to be killed before she could take too big a bite? An interesting theory. The question would be, too big a bite of what? Or whom? The same silent servant cleared the salads, brought in oversized china plates heavy with sizzling meat and thin, golden slices of grilled potatoes. Eve waited until they were alone again, then cut into her steak. When a man accumulates a great deal of money, possessions, and status, he then has a great deal to lose. Now we're speaking of me. Another interesting theory. He sat there, his eyes interested, yet still amused. She threatened me with some sort of blackmail and, rather than pay or dismiss her as ridiculous, I killed her. Did I sleep with her first? You tell me, Eve said evenly. It would fit the scenario, considering her choice of profession. There may be a blackout on the press on this particular case, but it takes little deductive power to conclude sex reared its head. I had her, then I shot her. If one subscribes to the theory. He took a bite of steak, chewed, swallowed. There's a problem, however, which is, I have what you might consider an old-fashioned quirk. I dislike brutalizing women, in any form. It's old-fashioned in that it would be more apt to say you dislike brutalizing people, in any form. He moved those elegant shoulders. As I say, it's a quirk. I find it distasteful to look at you and watch the candlelight shift over a bruise on your face. He surprised her by reaching out, running a finger down the mark, very gently. I believe I would have found it even more distasteful to kill Sharon de Blas. He dropped his hand and went back to his meal. Though I have, occasionally, been known to do what is distasteful to me. When necessary. How is your dinner? It's fine. The room, the light, the food, was all more than fine. It was like sitting in another world, in another time. Who the hell are you, Rourke? He smiled and topped off their glasses. You're the cop. Figure it out. She would, she promised herself. By God she would, before it was done. What other theories do you have about Sharon de Blas? None to speak of. She liked excitement and risk and didn't flinch from causing those who loved her embarrassment. Yet she was. Intrigued, Eve leaned closer. What? Go ahead, finish. Pitiable, he said, in a tone that made Eve believe he meant no more and no less at just that. There was something sad about her under all that bright gloss. Her body was the only thing about herself she respected. So she used it to give pleasure and to cause pain. And did she offer it to you? Naturally. And assumed I'd accept the invitation. Why didn't you? I've already explained that. I can elaborate and add that I prefer a different type of bedmate, and that I prefer to make my own moves. There was more, but he chose to keep it to himself. Would you like more steak, Lieutenant? She glanced down, saw that she'd all but eaten the pattern off the plate. Thanks. Dessert? She hated to turn it down, but she'd already indulged herself enough. I want to look at your collection, then we'll save the coffee and dessert for later. He rose, offered a hand. Eve merely frowned at it and pushed back from the table. Amused, Rourke gestured toward the doorway and led her back into the hall, up the curving stairs. It's a lot of house for one guy. Do you think so? I'm more of the opinion that your apartment is small for one woman. When she stopped at the top of the stairs, he grinned. Eve, You know I own the building. You'd have checked after I send my little token. You ought to have someone out to look at the plumbing," she told him. "I can't keep the water hot in the shower for more than 10 minutes. I'll make a note of it." Next flight up. "I'm surprised you don't have elevators," she commented as they climbed again. "I do. Just because I prefer the stairs doesn't mean the staff shouldn't have a choice." "And staff," she continued, "I haven't seen one remote domestic in the place. I have a few, but I prefer people to machines, most of the time." Here, he used a palm scanner, coded in a key, then opened carved double doors. The sensor switched on the lights as they crossed the threshold. Whatever she'd been expecting, it hadn't been this. It was a museum of weapons, guns, knives, swords, crossbows. Armor was displayed, from medieval ages to the thin, impenetrable vests that were a current military issue. Chrome and steel and jeweled handles winked behind glass, shimmered on the walls. If the rest of the house seemed another world, perhaps a more civilized one than what she knew, this veered jarringly in the other direction. "A celebration of violence, why?" was all she could say. "It interests me, what humans have used to damage humans through history." He crossed over, touching a wickedly toothed ball that hung from a chain. "Knights farther back than Arthur carried these into jousts and battles. 1,000 years. He pressed a series of buttons on a display cabinet and took out a sleek, palm-sized weapon, the preferred killing tool of 21st century street gangs during the urban revolt. "And we have something less cumbersome and equally lethal." Progression without progress. He put the weapon back, closed and secured the case. "But you're interested in something newer than the first, and older than the second. You said a 38, Smith Wesson, Model 10. It was a terrible room," she thought. Terrible and fascinating. She stared at him across it, realizing that the elegant violence suited him perfectly. "It must have taken years to collect all of this." 15. He said as he walked across the uncarpeted floor to another section. "Nearly 16 now. I acquired my first handgun when I was 19 from the man who was aiming it at my head." He frowned. He hadn't meant to tell her that. "I guess he missed," Eve commented as she joined him. "Fortunately, he was distracted by my foot in his garage." It was a 9mm Beretta semi-automatic he'd smuggled out of Germany. "He thought to use it to relieve me of the cargo I was delivering to him and save the transportation fee. In the end, I had the fee, the cargo, and the Beretta." "And so, Rourke Industries was born out of his poor judgment." "The one you're interested in," he added, pointing as the wall display opened. "You'll want to take it, I imagine, to see if it's been fired recently, check for prints, and so forth." She nodded slowly while her mind worked. Only 4 people knew the murder weapon had been left at the scene: herself, Feeney, the commander, and the killer. Rourke was either innocent or very, very clever. She wondered if he could be both. "I appreciate your cooperation." She took an evidence seal out of her shoulder bag and reached for the weapon that matched the one already in police possession. It took her only a heartbeat to realize it wasn't the one Rourke had pointed to. Her eyes slid to his, held. Oh, he was watching her all right, carefully. Though she let her hand hesitate now over her selection, she thought they understood each other. "Which?" "This." He tapped the display just under the .38. Once she'd sealed it and slipped it into her bag, he closed the glass. "It's not loaded, of course, but I do have ammo, if you'd like to take a sample." "Thanks. Your cooperation will be noted in my report." "Will it?" He smiled, took a box out of a drawer, and offered it. "What else will be noted, Lieutenant?" "Whatever is applicable." She added the box of ammo to her bag, took out a notebook, and punched in her ID number, the date, and a description of everything she'd taken. "Your receipt." She offered him the slip after the notebook spit it out. "These will be returned to you as quickly as possible unless they're called into evidence. You'll be notified one way or the other." He tucked the paper into his pocket, fingered what else he'd tucked there. "The music room's in the next wing. We can have coffee and brandy there." "I doubt we'd share the same taste in music, Rourke." "You might be surprised," he murmured, "at what we share." He touched her cheek again, this time sliding his hand around until it cupped the back of her neck. "At what we will share." She went rigid and lifted a hand to shove his arm away. He simply closed his fingers over her wrist. She could have had him flat on his back in a heartbeat, so she told herself. Still, she only stood there, the breath backing up in her lungs and her pulse throbbing hard and thick. He wasn't smiling now. "You're not a coward, Eve." He said it softly when his lips were an inch from hers. The kiss hovered there, a breath away, until the hand she levered against his arm changed its grip. And she moved into him. She didn't think. If she had, even for an instant, she would have known she was breaking all the rules. But she'd wanted to see, wanted to know, wanted to feel. His mouth was soft, more persuasive than possessive. His lips nibbled hers open so that he could slide his tongue over them, between them, to cloud her senses with flavor. He'd gathered like a fireball in her lungs even before he touched her, those clever hands molding over the snug denim over her hips, slipping seductively under her sweater to flesh. With a kind of edgy delight, she felt herself go damp. It was the mouth, just that generous and tempting mouth he'd thought he'd wanted. But the moment he'd tasted it, he'd wanted all of her. She was pressed against him, that tough, angular body beginning to vibrate. Her small, firm breast weighed gloriously in his palm. He could hear the hum of passion that sounded in her throat, all but taste it as her mouth moved eagerly on his. He wanted to forget the patience and control he'd taught himself to live by, and just ravage. Here, the violence of the need all but erupted inside him. Here and now, he would have dragged her to the floor if she hadn't struggled back, pale and panting. "This isn't going to happen." "The hell it isn't," he shot back. The danger was shimmering around him now. She saw it as clearly as she saw the tools of violence and death surrounding them. There were men who negotiated when they wanted something. There were men who just took. Some of us aren't allowed to indulge ourselves. Fuck the rules, Eve. He stepped toward her. If she had stepped back, he would have pursued, like any hunter after the prize. But she faced him squarely, and shook her head. "I can't compromise a murder investigation because I'm physically attracted to a suspect. Goddamn it, I didn't kill her." It was a shock to see his control snap, to hear the fury and frustration in his voice, to witness it wash vividly across his face, and it was terrifying to realize she believed him, and not be sure, not be absolutely certain if she believed because she needed to. "It's not as simple as taking your word for it. I have a job to do, a responsibility to the victim, to the system. I have to stay objective, and you can't," she realized. "Can't." They stared at each other as the communicator in her bag began to beep. Her hands weren't quite steady as she turned away, took the unit out. She recognized the code for the station on the display and entered her ID. After a deep breath, she answered the request for voice print verification. "Dallas, Lieutenant Eve." "No audio please. Display only." Rourke could just see her profile as she read the transmission. It was enough to measure the change in her eyes, the way they darkened, then went flat and cruel. She put the communicator away, and when she turned back to him, there was very little of the woman who'd vibrated in his arms in the woman who faced him now. "I have to go. We'll be in touch about your property." "You do that very well," Rourke murmured. "Slide right into the cop's skin. And it fits you perfectly." "It better." "Don't bother seeing me out. I can find my way." "Eve." She stopped at the doorway, looked back. There he was, a figure in black surrounded by eons of violence. Inside the cop's skin, the woman's heart stuttered. "We'll see each other again." She nodded. "Count on it." He let her go, knowing Somerset would slip out of some shadow to give her the leather jacket, bid her good night. Alone, Rourke took the gray fabric button from his pocket, the one he'd found on the floor of his limo, the one that had fallen from the jacket of that drab gray suit she'd worn the first time he'd seen her. Studying it, knowing he had no intention of giving it back to her, he felt like a fool.